It'll bite anyone who moves. The Kleshi trainer's warning hung in the air like static. Behind the triple-shielded glass, specimen R9 shifted slow, deliberate, every muscle coiled like a spring that hated being wound. Its slit pupils tracked the room with surgical malice, jaw flexing just enough to expose a neat row of toxin-dripping fangs. Riley stared at the thing and scratched his head. It was the kind of casual gesture one might expect in a zoo, not 6 meters from a creature bred to incapacitate a charging wargle mount in under a second. The room went dead quiet. One Kleshi technician dropped a tablet, another visibly stopped breathing. The predator blinked. "Did it? Just ignore that?" the head trainer whispered. Riley shrugged, already crouching to observe the creature's foot structure. "Back home, we call that a death stare. Used to get the same look from my neighbor's parrot." He squinted. "Or maybe her toddler. Hard to tell." "No sudden movements," the trainer hissed, beads of moisture gathering on his skin. "Its visual cortex is motion-linked. It should have struck." Riley looked up, unbothered. "Well, maybe it's just being polite." The Kleshi began frantically checking sensor logs. Riley smiled slightly as he pulled out a notepad. He'd seen that look before, right before a wild animal decided whether to bolt, bite, or bond. And if this thing was anything like the predators back home, the outcome would depend on one simple question. Did it see a threat or a friend? The Klesh 4 research facility sat like a shattered glass dome, nestled into the cratered landscape. Riley's first impression had been something between a luxury prison and a paranoid zoo. Between the drones, the pulse-locked doors, and the endless biometric scans, he had been scanned more times than his luggage during the entire interstellar trip. Terran liaison, animal behaviorist, he'd said at every checkpoint, voice losing an octave of energy each time. "Yes, I was vetted. Yes, I'm vaccinated. No, I'm not carrying contraband flora. Yes, I understand the containment protocols. No, I won't touch the death beast, probably." He hadn't expected the welcome to be warm, but the Kleshi head trainer's expression had been particularly unamused. "You were sent here to observe," the trainer had stated, pointing a scaled finger toward the bay window. "You are not to engage. You are not to test. You are not to provoke." That, the finger jabbed toward R9, is a fusion of apex DNA strands from 4 predator species. Its aggression threshold is coded into its spine. It has no empathy cortex, no social inhibitors. It will bite anyone who moves. Riley had responded by scratching his head. Now, 2 hours later, he sat alone in Observation Bay 3, a cup of synthetic coffee balanced on one knee and a digital notepad on the other. The reinforced glass pulsed faintly with energy containment, humming a low whine. R9 sat like a coiled lizard-cat hybrid, tail twitching in steady beats. It wasn't pacing. That surprised Riley. High-aggression creatures usually paced. Riley took a deep breath and tapped his finger against his boot. Subtle, no reaction. He tried blinking slowly. The creature blinked back. He leaned forward, deliberately exposing the side of his neck, a calculated show of trust among Terran carnivores. R9 flared its nostrils. "Interesting. You're going to get yourself killed," came the dry voice from behind. It was Varlis, one of the junior Kleshi trainers. She was young, by their standards barely 87 cycles, but already had the rigid demeanor of a compliance officer. "You do know you're not required to be here every cycle," she added. Riley didn't turn away from the glass. "Observation is the first step to understanding." "Understanding what? How your limbs taste?" He grinned faintly. "Look, he doesn't pace, doesn't lunge. He's listening, watching. That's more than reflexive aggression. It's not a he, it's an engineered bioform. It's not a pet. Neither was the mountain lion that wandered into my backyard when I was 10. Varlis made a confused noise in her throat. "You interacted with it?" Riley finally glanced over his shoulder. "No, I froze in place, peed my pants, and waited for it to leave. It did, eventually. But a few years later, I volunteered at a predator rehab center. Learned that fear is useful, but not the only tool." The Kleshi said nothing. "Your kind builds walls," Riley added. "We build bridges, sometimes very stupid, unsafe bridges, but still bridges. "You're going to be eaten," Varlas muttered, and walked away. By the third day, Riley had a full set of logs and an experimental posture chart for R9. He was meticulous about it, logging time, temperature, sound levels, and micro-gestures. From the twitch of the creature's secondary eyelid to the tension in its back limbs, everything had a pattern. He noticed that R9 would often press its claws flat against the floor when Riley was in the room, almost like grounding itself. And, if Riley stayed still long enough, it would mimic his breathing pattern slightly delayed. But the Kleshi observed all of this with increasing unease. On day 4, a scout drone clipped the edge of the cage while doing a standard flyby. R9 lunged. The drone exploded in a flash of sparks. Riley didn't flinch. He was watching the tail. "That wasn't rage," he said quietly. "That was irritation, like a cat being sprayed with water." "You continue to anthropomorphize a killing machine," Varlas said from her usual spot behind the bulkhead glass. Riley scratched the back of his neck. R9 tilted its head at the motion. There were signs, if anyone had bothered to look. The auto-calibration drone had been rebooting inconsistently for 3 days. The facility's internal diagnostics flickered during storm surges from the planet's sulfur-heavy magnetic field. And then there was Technician Soul, who, at 0300 shift change, tapped the edge of the containment panel and muttered, "I swear, if this damn fuse jumps again." It did. At 0314, during a routine system recalibration, the containment grid failed. The lights dropped to emergency red. All drones fell limp. The reinforced cage hissed open with a decompression moan. R9 stepped out. Not lunged, not charged. Stepped. Like it had been waiting. Klaxons screamed. Doors slammed shut. Kleshi researchers scattered. One shouted, "Play dead!" and promptly got trampled by a fellow technician. Behind a sealed door, Varlas shouted into a comlink, "Security lockdown! Apex breach! Sector 4! Through it all, Riley moved. Straight toward the creature. Someone screamed, "He's lost his mind." He probably had. His legs felt like gelatin, his right hand tingled, his breath was shallow and tight. But R9 was watching him. It didn't crouch, didn't growl, just stood there, flexing its clawed feet against the floor. Riley stopped 3 meters away, not close enough to be pounced without reaction time, not far enough to be safe. He raised one hand slowly. "Easy now," he whispered. "We're just 2 grumpy mammals trying to get through the day." R9 took a step forward. Riley's knees buckled just slightly. He forced himself to stay upright. Then, in a motion so slow, it felt like wading through tar, he reached out and placed a hand on the creature's head. It froze. He scratched. Right behind the primary ocular ridge. The creature rumbled a deep, seismic vibration that made the walls tremble. Not a warning, not a threat. A purr. R9's purring didn't stop. It grew louder, deeper, reverberating through the steel decking beneath Riley's boots. He could feel the vibration in his sternum. His fingers stayed where they were gently stroking the ridge between the apex predator's primary and secondary ocular planes. His arm burned. Every muscle wanted to shake. He kept still. Somewhere down the corridor, someone yelled for containment teams. Riley barely registered it. R9's posture shifted. The creature turned slightly, rubbing its broad head against Riley's palm. It was deliberate, measured, familiar, even. The absurdity finally hit him. He was standing in the middle of an unsecured corridor, unarmed, scratching the genetically forged product of 4 apex killers, and it was nuzzling. It would have been adorable if the thing didn't have salivary venom and a jaw force capable of crushing starship hull-grade polymers. When R9 finally stepped back, it didn't run, it didn't attack, it just looked at Riley, a long, unreadable look. Then it padded back toward the open cage, tail flicking behind it. No hesitation, no resistance. It entered the cell. Riley followed, slow and silent. Once the last claw crossed the threshold, he slammed his palm against the emergency override. Plasma bars surged back to life with a snap and hiss. Containment field stabilized. A low hum resumed. R9 sat, folded its hind legs under its body, and watched him. Only then did Riley's knees give out. Medical pulled him off the floor 12 minutes later. He didn't fight them, mostly because he couldn't. His right shoulder was locked, every muscle spasming from the prolonged tension of holding it still against a half-ton predator. His legs alternated between tremors and full-blown seizing. His pupils were pinpricks, skin cold, classic acute adrenaline shock response. Dr. Gell, a multi-limbed Avis medic with 4 degrees and the bedside manner of a steam hose, gave her verdict. "You are very stupid. Also lucky, but mostly stupid." "I'll take that," Riley mumbled, trying not to gag as she injected a stabilizer into his upper thigh. "You have no soft armor, no neural stims, no external telemetry monitoring. What were you thinking?" Riley didn't answer, partly because he didn't have the energy, and partly because he wasn't sure himself. One of the Kleshi observers stood at the foot of the medbay cot, arms folded, scales flickering pale blue concern. Varlis. She stared at him with something unreadable, not quite anger, not quite awe. "Do you have a death wish?" she asked at last. Riley lifted his head just enough to look her in the eye. "Do you?" She blinked. "I'm not the one who walked into a corridor with a rogue killing unit." "Then, you weren't paying attention." "To what?" He swallowed, winced at the tightness in his throat. It wasn't rogue, it was calm, curious, more aware than anything we've given it credit for. Varlis didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. "You bonded with it." "Bonded is a strong word." I scratched its head. "No one else can approach it." Riley slowly let his head fall back onto the cot. Then maybe someone else should try scratching its head. She didn't laugh. Kleshi never did. Riley remained under observation for 48 hours. During that time, he had 2 full adrenal panel scans, 1 MRI equivalent scan for micro-muscle tears, and 3 hydration IVs. His shoulder joint remained stiff for 3 days. By day 5, he could raise his arm halfway again without gritting his teeth. Physical recovery was only part of the story. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel the rumble of that purr echoing in his bones, and somewhere behind it, a tiny, irrational fear that, next time, R9 might not stop. They hadn't tested his psychological response officially, but he could see the way Gell watched him, notes taken discreetly, questions phrased just gently enough to feel like conversation. Nightmares? No. Panic symptoms? Not since the first night. Lingering fear of the subject? No. But I wouldn't want to be surprised by it in a dark hallway. Acceptable honesty. By the end of the first week post-incident, the facility had returned to cautious normalcy. Research cycles resumed, observation bays reopened. But only Riley visited R9. Varlis and the others monitored from behind reinforced blast glass, but none dared enter. Even drones approached with exaggerated care, flight paths rerouted to avoid direct sightlines. R9 watched Riley every time he entered. Didn't move, didn't blink for long periods, just watched. On day 8, Riley placed a folded piece of floor padding inside the cage, just behind the containment field, a silent offering. He didn't ask permission, didn't say a word. He set it down, backed away, and left. The next day, the pad was shredded. The day after that, a new one he placed was left untouched. On day 11, R9 curled up on it. Riley began talking to it, not loud, not forced, just low commentary during observations. "You ever seen a sunrise? I bet not. Klesh the 4 has garbage lighting, pale red streaks and too much cloud cover. You'd hate Earth. Way too many squirrels." The creature didn't respond. But it didn't leave, either. It would sit near the barrier, head tilted, listening. Riley kept a log of its reactions. Tail movement, pupil dilation, ear rotation, all noted. There was a pattern forming. It responded not to sound, but intonation, the rhythmic flow of speech. It reacted more strongly to certain pitches and cadences. One evening, while recounting a story about a particularly moody badger he'd rehabilitated in Montana, Riley laughed at his own joke. R9 blinked, slowly, then huffed. It wasn't a purr. But it wasn't a growl, either. The Kleshi Research Council summoned him on day 13. The room was sterilized, chrome, and tension. 7 of them sat behind a semicircular console, like a tribunal deciding whether to exile or knight him. The head trainer, whose name Riley had only heard once, Klesh, spoke first. Your behavior violated 12 containment protocols. Understood. You endangered the lives of over 50 researchers. I did. And you resecured a breached Apex unit with no weapons, no backup, and no safety tether. Riley didn't answer. He wasn't sure if that was a question or a commendation. Another Kleshi, this one older and with pale ivory ridges along his crown, leaned forward. Why? Riley met his eyes. Because in that moment, I was the only one it didn't see as a threat. Silence stretched. Then Klesh nodded once. And now? Now it watches. It listens. It chooses how to react. That implies a decision-making process beyond what its genome programming accounts for. You are suggesting sentience. I'm suggesting awareness, of emotion, of trust, of fear, maybe. It recognizes individuals. It didn't attack me because it remembered. And if we attempt interaction again? Riley hesitated. Don't send drones. Don't send suits. Don't move fast. Maybe bring a blanket. A flicker of confusion passed between the council members. 2 days later, Riley stood outside the containment chamber again, arm now fully mobile but still sore. He didn't enter. Not this time. He stayed behind the glass. Inside, R9 stared back. Riley lifted one hand, wiggled his fingers slightly. R9 rose, approached, and stopped exactly 1 pace from the barrier. It lowered its massive head and gently touched the glass where his hand hovered. Riley smiled. Behind him, Varlis whispered, "You built a cage out of trust." He nodded. Cages keep things in, trust lets them stay. R9 blinked and waited. It wasn't until the 3rd week that someone finally asked the question Riley had been expecting since day 1. How do you know it won't change its mind? The voice belonged to Hekran, one of the xenoneurologists, a species whose name Riley couldn't pronounce without dislocating his jaw. Hekran had a barrel-shaped body and 12 legs, but his eyes, soft, gray orbs ringed in biofilm, were unusually expressive for his kind. Today, they looked genuinely uncertain. Riley didn't look up from his notepad. You mean, how do I know it won't decide I look like lunch one day? Yes. I don't. There was an awkward silence. Riley sighed and set the pad down. You've all spent weeks watching a creature adapt faster than anyone expected. That's what scares you. Not the teeth, not the toxins, it's the choice. It hasn't attacked me again, not because it can't, but because it won't. And that makes it unpredictable, which makes it terrifying. Hekran tapped his frontmost limb against the floor. So why continue to interact with it? Because we've domesticated predators before, Riley said, finally standing. And the first step is always the same. You prove you're worth trusting, and you hope they decide not to eat you in your sleep. Day 21. The protocol shifted. Riley was no longer allowed solo sessions. The Kleshi didn't say it out loud, but the implication was clear. Containment breach or not, Riley wasn't going to get a second pass if R9 had a change of heart. So now, every visit involved an escort, a 3-person remote strike unit stationed behind the observation wall, and a pair of aerial shock drones hovering just above the chamber threshold. Riley hated it. The first day the drones entered, R9 recoiled. It didn't snarl, didn't strike, but its body language screamed warning. Shoulders high, tail locked, not aggressive, defensive. Get them out, Riley said immediately. The operator on comms hesitated. Protocol requires. Get them out, you're undoing everything. The drones were pulled back. R9 watched them go, then lowered its head slightly. Not submission, not comfort, something else. Disappointment. Back in the lab, Riley leaned over a 3D mapping of R9's neural activity spikes. The charts showed a staggering array of pattern development, most triggered by auditory cues and nonverbal gestures. You're sure it isn't echoing behavior through mimicry? Varlis asked from beside him. No mimicry, Riley muttered. The latency between stimulus and response is too long. It's not just repeating me, it's processing. Varlis stared at the data. That shouldn't be possible. Neither should a 2-ton apex hybrid deciding to climb back into its cage on its own, Riley said dryly. Yet, here we are. She fell silent for a while, scanning the lines. After a moment, she asked, Have you named it? Riley blinked. What? Specimen R9. You talk to it every day. Have you given it a name? He paused. Then, sheepishly, I call it Moat. Varlas looked surprised. Moat? Yeah, it was the name of this ancient, half-wild guard dog in a story my grandfather told. Said it didn't bark, didn't chase, didn't even look angry, just stood in the yard, silent, watchful, and no one ever tried to cross. She nodded once. Fitting. Riley's next few sessions focused on interaction variation. No sudden gestures, no new scents. But he started testing visual stimuli. He wore a red scarf one day. Moat tracked it with laser focus, but didn't react aggressively. He hummed low notes on another day, shifting pitch carefully. Moat seemed particularly interested in D and A tones. By week 4, Riley had introduced 2 new tools, a low-frequency soundboard and a padded ball, both placed just beyond the barrier. Moat sniffed the soundboard, but ignored the ball for days. Then one afternoon, Riley entered to find the ball missing. Moat had curled around it like a nesting animal. He recorded every moment. The recovery was slower than Riley expected. Not his body, his shoulder was almost back to full strength, though it still twinged during sleep, but his nerves. Every night brought the same tightness in his chest. Not fear, anticipation, a sort of creeping anxiety that maybe he had been lucky, and the next moment would snap that illusion apart. And still, every morning, he went back. Moat would be waiting. The Union observers arrived without fanfare. 6 species, 12 delegates, all flown in under diplomatic veil to assess what the Kleshi were now referring to quietly as the Riley anomaly. The observers weren't allowed direct access to the containment chamber, but Riley could feel their stares through the glass. On the first session under review, he entered as normal. Moat was curled in his usual place, head resting on the same floor pad Riley had replaced the week before. Riley sat near the edge of the barrier, cross-legged. He waited. 2 minutes passed, then 3. Moat stirred, rose, walked to the barrier, and calmly, confidently pressed his head to the spot where Riley's hand hovered. Behind the glass, one of the Union delegates whispered something in stunned disbelief. Riley scratched behind the ocular ridge. Moat rumbled. In the debrief, a Tasharian observer stood and asked, Is this behavior replicable? Riley shook his head. Not in the way you're thinking. The delegate narrowed his eyes. You believe the bond is unique? No, I believe the process is unique. The patience, the observation, the willingness to be vulnerable. A different delegate, this one from the Tar Coalition, folded its shimmering wings. But your species has a history of aggressive dominance. You conquer, you tame, you kill. How does this behavior fit that pattern? Riley's mouth twitched. It doesn't. Not always. Sometimes we raise wolves in our homes and call them dogs. Sometimes we find things that scare us and choose to understand them anyway. That night, he didn't sleep. He watched old footage of predator rehabilitation programs from Earth. Wolves, lions, even orcas. The same patterns. The same slow dance of fear and trust. He remembered the moment a jaguar he once worked with had finally leaned its full weight into his side, as if saying, Fine, you're not so bad. It had taken 6 months. Moat had needed 3 weeks. Riley didn't know if that made him feel awed or terrified. Maybe both. Day 29. Final review. The Kleshi Council and Union delegates stood behind triple blast shielding. A safety drone hovered above. A secondary drone hovered behind Riley this time, his only real concession to protocol. He stepped into the chamber. Calm. Hands open. Moat was already near the barrier. Riley crouched slowly and extended both arms, not close enough to touch, but enough to show full posture exposure. Moat moved forward. Then did something he'd never done before. He lowered his head not just in greeting, but in full prostration. Flattened body, head on paws, eyes closed for 3 full seconds. It was a gesture Riley had only ever seen from certain large felines in moments of total trust. The room behind the glass went dead silent. Riley didn't say a word. He just walked forward and sat beside him. No glass, no drones, no barriers. Moat curled his tail around him. The apex predator rested. The stillness in the observation bay lingered long after the final session ended. No alarms, no lunges, no trauma teams on standby. Just a man sitting beside a creature engineered to kill him, their shadows stretched long under the low halogen lights. Moat slept with his head near Riley's foot, not touching, but close enough that the breath from his snout stirred the cuff of Riley's pants. The only sound was the occasional mechanical sigh of the ventilation system. Behind triple-reinforced glass, scientists and delegates watched in stunned silence. One of them whispered, "It thinks he's part of its pack." "No," said Varlas softly. "It thinks he's not a threat. That's harder." By morning, the lab was buzzing with questions, theories, speculation. The full sensor readouts confirmed what no one had believed possible. No spike in stress hormones from the subject. No increase in aggression markers. In fact, R9 Moat had shown the lowest sympathetic reactivity since creation. Riley skimmed the data with a weary gaze, jaw tight. He hadn't slept. Not out of anxiety this time, but out of a strange, unshakable guilt. He knew what was coming. When Varlas entered the debrief room mid-afternoon, she didn't speak at first. She just handed him a hard copy report. He flipped through the pages, biometric overlays, containment logs, psychological evaluations. Near the end, stamped in Terran Standard and Klesh High Code, was the final summary. Recommended directive: subject reclassification, non-aggressive observational entity. Authorized human interaction protocol, approved. Replication of interaction strategy, prohibited. He exhaled through his nose. They're not going to let anyone else try, are they? No, she said. Too many variables, too much risk. No other specimen of this class will ever be permitted out of hard containment. Moat doesn't belong in a cell. And yet, she said quietly, this is the only place we know he won't be killed. He stared at the report for a long moment. They're going to shelve him. Varlas didn't argue. 2 days later, the official conclusion was filed to the Galactic Science Union. It was co-signed by representatives from the Klesh Oversight Council, 3 xenopsychology boards, and a reluctant Avis diplomat. The title of the report was clinical: Terrans and Predators, Unknown Bonding Mechanisms, Reckless Methodology, High Success Rate. Appendix A consisted of one line: do not attempt to replicate, ever. Riley stood just outside the chamber one final time. His duffel bag was packed, medical clearances signed, transport shuttle scheduled for departure at local morning cycle. The containment door remained closed. Moat was inside, sprawled on the floor pad with his front paws tucked under his chest. He wasn't asleep. He was watching. Riley placed a flat hand on the glass. Moat rose and padded forward. No hesitation, no growl. He pressed his broad skull gently to the spot on the glass opposite Riley's hand. "I know," Riley whispered. "You hate goodbyes." Moat's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, just awareness. That same unblinking, assessing gaze from day one. "I'm not abandoning you, I promise, but if I stay, they'll never study you as anything but a reflection of me." He pulled something from his pocket, a soft strip of fabric, faded, but clean, the same red scarf he'd worn during week 3 of testing. He folded it neatly, then slid it into the containment hatch tray. The automated drawer whirred and passed it through. Moat took it in his mouth. Sat held it. The image carved itself deep into Riley's mind. His shuttle left at dawn. Varlas walked with him to the transport pad. "You'll be debriefed again when you reach the Terran embassy," she said, eyes forward. "The report has already triggered interest from 9 other species. 3 want training seminars, 4 have requested Terran case studies in predator handling, and 2 want your neural patterns mapped." Riley adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "Let them be curious. Just don't let them be careless." She stopped just before the gangway. "I thought you were reckless. I thought you were suicidal." "I was terrified the whole time," he admitted. "And yet, you still walked toward it." He gave her a tired smile. "Fear is just your brain saying, this is probably a bad idea. Courage is answering, maybe. But let's find out anyway." Her skin flushed a pale gold respect. Then she handed him something. A polished case, simple but elegant. Inside, nestled on a dark velvet pad, was a single-scale matte black with a faint iridescent sheen. There were no teeth marks. "You weren't supposed to go near it," she said, "but you didn't just survive it, you changed it." He closed the case slowly. He changed himself. She nodded once, then turned and left. Back on Earth, Riley spent the first week recovering from what the embassy called cumulative psychophysiological exhaustion. He called it sleeping for 16 hours and eating 12 full meals in 3 days. The second week, he gave 2 interviews. The third week, he politely declined an offer to license his methodology into a galactic security curriculum. He spent his evenings walking trails outside the Montana Research Conservatory. No wild predators, no fences, just open sky and memory. Sometimes